She quits within a week. That's what Dr. Pierce Hargrove said, slamming a $20 bill on the break room table with enough force to make the coffee cups rattle. He said it loud enough for 3 nurses to hear. He said it like it was already decided. What he didn't know was that Natalie Hayes had survived 7 years of being erased. What he didn't know was standing 3 feet away, refilling a water bottle with the kind of stillness that comes from having already survived the worst. Sacred Heart Emergency Department sprawls across the 4th floor of a Houston high-rise, all chrome railings and antiseptic smells that can't quite cover the metallic copper of old blood and burnt coffee. The fluorescent lights hum at exactly 120 hertz, Natalie counted once, out of habit, the way she counted everything now. Respiratory rate. Heart rate. Time between breaths. The lights buzz like a wounded animal, constant and barely perceptible unless you're the type of person trained to notice everything. She was that type. She had been for 18 years. Natalie moved through the ER corridors with economy of motion, her body a study in efficiency. No wasted steps. No unnecessary movements. Her scrubs were wrinkled from the night shift, her dark hair pulled back in a braid so tight it pulled the skin at her temples. She kept her eyes down, not submissive exactly, but deliberately unobtrusive. The Pentagon had been very specific 7 years ago in Ramadi when they made her disappear. Keep your head down. Don't surface. Vanishing acts are only effective if you actually vanish. So she did. She became the kind of nurse everyone forgot by the end of their shift. The one who was always there but never noticed. The one who fixed problems without announcing them. Her hands moved through the supply room with practiced precision, organizing trauma kits in the 3rd bay. The boots she wore were regulation non-slip, boring, forgettable, the kind that could be found in any hospital locker room. But beneath the fluorescent lights, if you looked closely, you could see the edge of something else peeking out from the top of her sock line. A scar. Long deliberate. The kind that told a story if you knew how to read it. Dr. Pierce Hargrove stood in the doorway of the supply closet, his expensive shoes silent on the linoleum tile. He wore a Rolex, $12000, stainless steel, the kind that said he knew exactly what he was worth and expected everyone else to know it too. His white coat was tailored, his tie silk, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He was 53 years old and had been the emergency department director for 12 years, which meant he'd been running his kickback scheme with Caldwell Medical Supply for 12 years as well. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity: inflate invoices on surgical kits, phantom orders on equipment that never arrived, medical supplies marked as delivered that existed only on paperwork. Hargrove got a percentage. Caldwell got guaranteed contracts. Nobody looked too hard at an ER that always seemed perfectly stocked and infinitely efficient. Until Natalie Hayes showed up 3 weeks ago. He watched her now as she restocked the trauma bay, her fingers moving through the ritual with the kind of muscle memory that came from doing it 10,000 times before. 14-gauge angiocath needles arranged by size. Surgical kits counted and logged. Every single item documented in her handwriting, which was small and precise and completely illegible to anyone trying to skim it. She logged the date, the time, the item, the quantity. Every day. Every shift. Building a record that would make it impossible to explain discrepancies. She didn't know she was being watched. Or if she did, she gave no indication of it. Hargrove had learned that about her already. She never gave any indication of anything. No reaction to his condescending comments during rounds. No response to the way he'd referred to her as the temp in front of patients. No flinch when he'd stood too close during shift briefing, using the power of proximity the way men like him did. She simply worked. Her hand steady as a surgical laser even when the ER was full and the monitors were screaming. Those hands bothered him. Not the steadiness, plenty of nurses had steady hands. What bothered him was the precision. There was a laceration repair in Bay 2 at 2:33 a.m., a drunk who'd punched a window at a strip club, severed the extensor carpi radialis longus tendon, bleeding like he'd opened an artery. Hargrove had been ready to call plastics, schedule an operating room, pump up the bill. But Natalie had asked permission to do the repair herself. Just asked, no argument, no pushback. And then he'd watched her work. 3 stitches. 3. The kind of tissue approximation you didn't see anymore, the kind that required training and institutional knowledge and a familiarity with human anatomy that went deeper than a standard nursing degree. The wound closed like she'd never opened it. The drunk woke up the next morning and said it didn't even hurt. 3 stitches, perfect alignment, the kind of work that belonged in an operating room with a surgeon holding the instruments, not in a trauma bay with a quiet new nurse moving like she had all the time in the world even though the monitor behind her was screaming that her patient's blood pressure was dropping. He'd asked her afterward, "Where did you learn to do that?" She'd met his eyes for exactly 1 second, not challenging, not submissive, just briefly present, and said, "Experience." That was all. 1 word. No elaboration. No explanation of where that experience came from or how a travel nurse working at Sacred Heart for 3 weeks had learned techniques that belonged to surgeons with 15 years of fellowship training. Hargrove had checked her application. It was sparse. Nursing degree from a state school. 3 years at a community hospital in Nevada. References from a temp agency that was professional but vague. No details about her actual background. No list of special training, nothing that would explain the way she moved through a crisis like she'd been born in one. There was a gap in her work history, 6 years unaccounted for. When he'd asked about it, she'd said simply, personal reasons. Not apologetic. Not evasive. Just a statement of fact. The thing about people with secrets is that they're meticulous. They have to be. 1 mistake, 1 careless word, 1 moment of inattention and everything unravels. So they're careful. They document. They keep records. They notice things. They notice when supplies don't match invoices. They notice when surgical kits that are supposed to be delivered haven't been opened. They notice when the numbers don't add up. Natalie Hayes was meticulous. It was 3:15 p.m. when the scrub tech froze. His name was Rodriguez, 28 years old, former Marine Corps medic, 3 tours in Helmand Province before a Humvee-borne IED ended his combat role and turned him into the guy who sterilized instruments and prepped patients for sutures. He was good at it. Reliable. Quiet. The kind of hospital employee who didn't ask questions and didn't make trouble. He was assisting on a laceration repair, a 6-year-old with a gash on her forehead from a bicycle accident, bleeding steady but not arterial. Natalie had taken the case. Of course she had. The attending physician was in bay for dealing with a possible myocardial infarction. The other senior nurses were already tied up. So Natalie cleaned the wound, prepped the suture tray, and began the tissue approximation with the kind of focus that made the entire room go quiet. The child had stopped crying by the time Natalie was finished. Not from drugs. Not from distraction. Just from watching the calm, methodical movements of someone who'd clearly done this before. Done it in conditions that made a sterile trauma bay look like a 5-star hotel. Rodriguez was supposed to pass instruments. Instead, he froze. His hand stopped mid-motion. The suture needle hung suspended above the tray like it had been caught in amber. Natalie didn't look up. She just waited, her own hand steady, her breathing unchanged. After 3 seconds, 3 seconds that felt like 3 minutes, Rodriguez passed the needle. But before he did, he leaned in close enough that only she would hear him. Close enough that the attending physician in the other bay wouldn't catch what he said. "I know that hand," he whispered. "Jolin District. Forward Operating Base. You were in Ramadi." It wasn't a question. Natalie tied the final knot. Cut the suture thread. Step back. 1 measured breath. Then she met Rodriguez's eyes for exactly 1 second, the same 1 second she'd given Hargrove, and said nothing. She didn't deny it. She didn't confirm it. She just looked at him in a way that made it clear he'd understood something he wasn't supposed to understand. Rodriguez's jaw clenched. His hands trembled slightly as he began sterilizing the tray. Not from fear. From recognition. From having suddenly realized that the quiet new travel nurse with the unremarkable application was someone he'd known in a different life. Someone who'd worked in a combat hospital in Ramadi during his second tour. Someone who'd saved a Marine who'd been bleeding out from a compound fracture with arterial damage. Someone the Marines had whispered about in the way soldiers whisper about other soldiers who aren't quite like the rest. "Thank you," he said quietly, collecting the instruments. "For what you did." Back then, Natalie was already removing her gloves, already moving on to the next task, already becoming invisible again. "Boots in the locker," Rodriguez said. Very quietly. "Those are Ramadi boots." She didn't answer. But that night, when she opened her locker in the staff room, she found a small challenge coin sitting on top of her shift schedule. Brass. Tarnished. On one side was inscribed a call sign, Reaper. On the other side, Hellman 2009. She picked it up. Felt the weight of it in her palm. 18 years of invisibility, and suddenly a Marine Corps medic knew exactly who she was. She was still holding it when Dr. Hargrove walked past the lockers, his phone pressed to his ear, already making calls. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of institutional fluorescent lighting. Natalie was restocking the crash cart by the supply closet when Dr. Hargrove pushed through the double doors, his phone tucked against his shoulder, his voice carrying the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being heard. The day shift was changing over, 47 staff members clustered around the coffee maker, the vending machine, the worn ergonomic chairs that had supported tired bodies for decades. Hargrove raised a $20 bill above his head like a flag, smooth and deliberate, making sure every eye in the room tracked the movement. "New pool, people," he announced, his smile spreading across his face like something predatory. "I'm betting this 20 that our new mousy friend quits within a week. She's got that look, too soft for the real work. Too careful. Too precise. That kind of perfectionism doesn't survive the chaos." He gestured vaguely in the direction Natalie had been standing. "She'll crack by Thursday at the latest. Anyone want in on the action?" Laughter rippled through the break room, the reflexive, easy laughter of people who had learned to laugh along with authority. A respiratory therapist leaned against the counter. A surgical tech nudged an ICU nurse. The $20 bill disappeared into Hargrove's pocket, but the damage was already done. Natalie stood at the coffee maker, her back to the room, her jaw locked so tightly that pain radiated down her neck and into her shoulders. She took one measured breath. Then another. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like trapped insects. She didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. She simply set her empty cup on the counter and returned to restocking supplies, bandages, saline flushes, medication cards, her hands moving with mechanical precision. Her military training had taught her that silence was sometimes louder than any argument. Restraint was a weapon. Let them think she was breaking. Let them think they were winning. 3 days passed. The bet circulated through the nursing shifts like a virus. Natalie kept her head down, her shoulders level, her voice steady when she spoke. She charted meticulously, restocked without being asked, answered pages before they completed their first cycle. On the third day, during lunch rush, the cafeteria was packed with 40 hospital staff, nurses, technicians, orderlies, administrative personnel, all compressed into a space designed for half that many. Natalie stood in line with her tray, a turkey sandwich on whole wheat, a salad with balsamic vinegar, a plastic cup of black coffee, and 3 patient charts she needed to file after eating. Dr. Hargrove appeared beside her, materializing from the crowd like a shark detecting blood in water. His white coat was immaculate, his stethoscope draped around his shoulders like a badge of authority. He gestured at her tray with his index finger, a casual movement that suggested he was about to ask a simple question. "Hayes, did you finish restocking the crash carts like I asked?" His voice was pleasant. Conversational. The voice of a man about to break someone in public. "Yes, Dr. Hargrove." She met his eyes for 1/10 of a second, then back to her food. Logged and signed off at 0600 hours. Epinephrine, atropine, sodium bicarb, everything accounted for. Good. Good. He nodded, his hand still extended toward her tray. Competence matters in this department. Standards matter. And then, with a movement so smooth it looked almost accidental, he reached across and tipped her tray forward. The world slowed into individual frames. The sandwich tumbled. The salad spilled in a cascading arc of greens and red vinaigrette. The coffee cup toppled, its contents spreading across the tile in a brown wave. The patient charts scattered like autumn leaves, their edges curling as the liquid soaked through them, rendering the documentation illegible, the information lost. Papers scattered across the floor in front of 40 witnesses. The cafeteria went silent, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. Conversation died mid-sentence. The sound of the salad bar fan became suddenly audible, almost deafening. Hargrove's smile widened. Oops. Pick that up, sweetheart. We can't have sloppy nurses leaving messes everywhere, can we? Liability issues. Infection control. You understand. Natalie kneeled on the tile floor. Her uniform was already stained with coffee. The ruined charts lay in front of her, their careful documentation leaking away into the grout. She gathered the papers methodically, her movements precise despite the chaos in her chest. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. They had held lives together in sandstorms. They had sutured wounds under mortar fire. They had learned long ago how to function when everything inside was cracking. A single tear escaped down her left cheek, not from sadness, but from the sheer pressure of restraint, the weight of 7 years of silence, the accumulated gravity of being invisible. She didn't wipe it away immediately. Instead, she stayed in that kneeling position and looked up at his shoes, Italian leather, probably $800, probably paid for with kickback money that she could see in the hospital's billing records but had been ordered 7 years ago to forget existed. Then she reached up and wiped the tear away without breaking eye contact with his polished shoes. Her voice, when she spoke, was tempered steel wrapped in silk, a voice that had commanded men in desert cities, a voice that carried the weight of authority she had spent 5 years erasing. I've cleaned up worse messes than you'll ever make, Doctor. The words hung in the air like a promise and a threat simultaneously. Hargrove's smile faltered for the first time. Something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps, that the woman kneeling on the floor was not the soft, broken thing he had been expecting. That there was something in her voice, some resonance of command, that suggested she had survived considerably worse than public humiliation in a hospital cafeteria. Natalie stood, holding the ruined charts against her chest, her shoulders level, her breathing controlled. She had been trained by the United States Navy for 12 years. She had conducted emergency surgery in environments with active sniper fire. She had held the hands of Marines who were dying and convinced them it would be okay, using nothing but her voice and her steady hands. A ruined lunch was nothing. Public mockery was nothing. The weight of invisibility was considerably more, but she had learned to carry that too. That afternoon, Hargrove stormed into the nurse's station where Natalie was updating the digital patient census. The gesture was theatrical, designed to be seen, designed to be remembered. He threw a patient chart at her chest, the hard plastic binder hitting between her ribs and bouncing off onto her lap. Several nurses at the desk pretended to look at their computers. A medical student in the corner became suddenly very interested in the wall-mounted monitor. Your documentation is sloppy, your attitude is insubordinate, and you're making the whole department look bad, Hargrove said, his voice rising to ensure maximum witnesses. Maybe the ER isn't the right fit for someone with your limited skill set. Some people just don't have what it takes for emergency medicine. No shame in that. Some people are better suited for administrative work. Filing. Data entry. Things that don't require real clinical judgment. Natalie caught the chart before it fell, set it precisely on the desk in front of her, and returned her attention to her computer without a word. She didn't defend herself. She didn't argue. She simply continued her work, her movements measured and deliberate, her face a blank slate that gave him nothing to feed on, no reaction to amplify his sense of power. The silence from Natalie seemed to agitate him further. He wanted a response, anger, tears, defensiveness, anything he could use to justify his next move. Instead, he got only her continued competence, her steadfast refusal to break, her absolute refusal to give him the satisfaction of visible distress. He left the nurse's station, his jaw tight, already making mental notes about conversations he would need to have, phone calls he would need to make, alliances he would need to activate. He had underestimated how quickly he would need to escalate from social cruelty to strategic sabotage. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what changed everything. That afternoon, at 1,340 hours, a man in a crisp polo shirt, 68 years old, probably an executive or a banker, the kind of man who had never waited for anything in his life, collapsed in the waiting room like someone had cut his strings. The triage nurse called for a code. The heart monitor began its frantic, irregular beeping. The waiting room at Sacred Heart fell silent the way a combat zone does just before impact. A man in a pressed polo shirt, Marine General Marcus Whitmore, 68, chest decorated with ribbons even civilians recognized, stood up from the plastic chair. His hand went to his sternum. His face went the color of old concrete. "I can't breathe," he said. Not panic. Just a statement. The way a soldier reports a casualty. The triage nurse's voice cracked over the intercom. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 3. Now. Natalie was 3 feet away, restocking the vitals cart with fresh blood pressure cuffs. She heard the collapse before she saw it. The sound of a body hitting linoleum like cargo. Her head came up. The general was on his back. His lips already turning blue. His chest barely moving. Dr. Hargrove was the attending. He came around the corner at a jog, stethoscope already out, and stopped cold. He stared at the general like the general was a problem someone else was supposed to solve. His hands trembled. Not from exertion. From something deeper. Fear, maybe. Or the sudden weight of actually having to save a life instead of just managing the paperwork that made him rich. Natalie didn't wait for a command she could see he wasn't going to give. She moved. Her hands grabbed the betadine swab from the crash cart, muscle memory, 7 years of invisibility erased in a single moment, and she dropped to her knees beside the general's chest. Her fingers mapped his anatomy the way they'd mapped 100 dying men in the dust of Fallujah. Subxiphoid approach. The angle between his ribs. The space where the needle needed to go. 2 seconds. That's all it took to mark the entry point. Spinal needle, she said. Not a request. An order. The scrub tech froze. His eyes went to Dr. Hargrove. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. The trembling in his hand spread to his shoulders. Now, Natalie said. The needle was in her hand before anyone processed what was happening. 14 gauge. The weight of it familiar in her palm like it had never left. Like 7 years of pretending to be someone smaller, quieter, less dangerous had been a costume she could shed in a heartbeat. The general gasped. His oxygen saturation was in the low 60s. His blood pressure was a whisper. His pericardium, the sac around his heart, was filling with fluid. Tamponade. His heart was being suffocated from the inside, and every second they waited, the pressure squeezed another few milliliters of blood away from his brain. Natalie's breathing didn't change. Her hands didn't shake. She'd done this in a field hospital outside Ramadi with incoming mortars walking their way down the supply road, with a generator dying out and flashlights held by medics whose hands wouldn't stop shaking. She'd done this in the dark. In the dust. With nothing but training and the absolute certainty that hesitation meant a body bag. The needle went in at exactly the right angle. Subcostal insertion, aiming toward the left shoulder at 45 degrees, just as she'd been taught by a trauma surgeon whose name she was no longer allowed to speak. The moment the needle pierced the pericardium, the resistance changed. The syringe filled. Dark blood. 60 milliliters. The build-up of a slow bleed, maybe from a torn coronary vessel, maybe from a rupture the general didn't even know he had until his heart started drowning in its own space. The general's breath came back in a gasp. His color changed from corpse gray to something almost human again. 80 milliliters. The monitor above his head began its climb. BP rising. 90 systolic. 95. 100. The heart rate steadied. The irregular chaos of the monitor screen resolved into something that looked almost like a rhythm. "He's coming back," someone whispered. The scrub tech was staring at her hands like they belonged to a ghost. "I know that hand," he said, so quiet only she could hear. "That three-stitch technique. Ramadi. You were in Ramadi." Natalie withdrew the needle, applied pressure with a gauze pad, and didn't look at him. The general's color was coming back. Pink now instead of blue. His chest rising and falling on his own. The ventilator stood ready, but it wasn't necessary. "Not yet." "Get him to ICU," Natalie said. Her voice had changed. It didn't have the careful, deferential softness of the nurse they'd hired 3 months ago. This voice carried weight. Precision. Command. Cardiac monitor the whole way. 2 large bore 4s. Type and cross for 4 units. Get interventional cardiology on the phone. He needs an echo and imaging. The transport team moved. They didn't hesitate. They didn't look at Dr. Hargrove for permission. They looked at her. She stood up as the stretcher rolled past, the general's hand reaching out as if to say something, but the oxygen mask covered his face and the team moved too fast. His eyes found hers for a single second, recognition, gratitude, the look of a man who understood he'd just been pulled back from the edge by someone who knew exactly how to do it. Then he was gone down the corridor toward the elevators. The ER went back to its normal rhythm almost immediately. Phones ringing. Monitors beeping. The particular kind of organized chaos that hospitals bred like bacteria. But something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The air pressure had changed. Everyone was still moving, still working, but the current had reversed. Natalie could feel it in the way the nurses glanced at her. In the way the resident who'd been watching the whole thing opened his mouth and then closed it again, as if he'd just realized he had no idea who he was looking at. Dr. Hargrove had turned white. Not the white of exhaustion or relief. The white of a man watching something he didn't understand. He pulled her aside as the ER settled back into rhythm, his hand gripping her elbow hard enough that it might leave a mark. She let him. For now. "You performed a procedure without physician supervision," he hissed. His voice had lost its earlier confidence. It sounded like something small and wounded, trying to sound large. "That's beyond your scope. That's beyond anything a nurse is legally allowed to do, and I will make sure you never work in healthcare again. Do you understand me?" Natalie looked at his hand on her arm. Then at his face. Her expression didn't change. It was the expression of someone looking at a problem that had already been solved. "The patient was in cardiac tamponade," she said quietly. "Every second we waited, his pressure was dropping. You were frozen. Someone had to act." "You don't get to decide that," Hargrove said. "You don't get to." She pulled her arm free with barely any effort. Muscle memory again. 7 years of restraint, 7 years of keeping herself smaller, weaker, invisible, and he'd never even thought to wonder what she'd been before that. She walked away before he could finish. But that wasn't the worst part. She'd made a mistake. One small mistake born from 7 years of trying to be someone she wasn't. She'd let him see her hands. She'd let him see her competence. She'd let herself forget that competence was a threat to men like Hargrove. In his office 20 minutes later, with his door closed, Hargrove sat at his desk with his phone in his hand and his face the color of infected meat. She could see him through the glass wall that separated the administrative offices from the main ER. His mouth was moving. His other hand was gesturing. His finger jabbed the desk like he was driving nails into someone's coffin. He was making calls. The first one went to a board member, Daniel Pritchard, the hospital's liaison to the medical supply company that paid Hargrove $40,000 a month in consulting fees disguised as equipment recommendations. The second went to another board member, Sarah Chen, who'd voted to approve the ventilator contracts that were marked up 300%. The third went somewhere in the basement, to someone whose voice came through the phone like gravel, the external investigator that the state nursing board sometimes sent when they wanted to make sure a complaint had teeth. Natalie could read his lips. Beyond her scope. Unsupervised procedure. Lacks proper credentials. The words landed like rounds. By 14-15 hours, the first domino had fallen. The temp agency that had placed Natalie at Sacred Heart received a call. Natalie had allegedly missed 2 shifts, she hadn't, but the records could be doctored, and Hargrove knew someone in payroll who owed him a favor. Medication errors, fabricated, but reported with enough confidence that they sounded real. Unsafe practice. By 14:30 hours, the investigator from the state board was already looking through files. Her credentials. Her certifications. The way they were listed in the hospital system. Hargrove had made sure everything was as unclear as possible, the better to create reasonable doubt. By 14:45 hours, he had Dr. Morrison on the phone, the attending who should have done the pericardiocentesis himself, the attending Hargrove had leverage over because Morrison had signed off on those inflated supply contracts and would lose his job if they were audited. She performed a procedure, Hargrove was saying. Without supervision. Without board certification for the technique. I documented it. I have witnesses. What he didn't say, he had witnesses who worked for him. He had documentation he could alter. He had a network of people whose careers depended on keeping his corruption quiet, and a nurse with meticulous charting and military-grade attention to detail was the kind of person who could bring that whole careful structure down if she ever looked at the numbers the wrong way. Natalie stood at the medication cart, filling a syringe with pain medication for a patient in Bay 7, and watched the whole thing unfold through the glass like watching a landslide in slow motion. She recognized the pattern. She'd seen it before in a different context, in a different lifetime. The way a threat gets identified and neutralized. The way an organization protects itself. Except she wasn't a threat to be managed anymore. She was something else entirely. The syringe clicked into place. She moved toward the patient's room, steady and unhurried. Behind her, in his glass-walled office, Hargrove was making his 4th call. The trap was already set. And Natalie Hayes, Senior Chief Petty Officer, decorated field surgeon, woman who'd been officially erased by the United States government for operations she still wasn't allowed to discuss, just walked into it with her eyes open, knowing exactly what was coming, because you didn't survive Ramadi by not understanding how powerful men responded when they were cornered. The 3 hours after Natalie saved General Whitmore's life were the most efficient hours of destruction Dr. Hargrove had ever orchestrated. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He simply activated the network, the one he'd spent 15 years building, the one that made hospital administrators answer his calls at 2 in the morning without hesitation. At 1,315 hours, while Natalie was still in the ICU documenting the pericardiocentesis with the precision of someone accustomed to writing reports that might appear before congressional committees, Dr. Hargrove sat in his private office with the door locked and began making calls. First was Gerald Pemberton, the hospital board chair, a man who'd received a $47,000 donation to his daughter's private school from a medical supply company that Hargrove had personally connected him with. The call lasted 90 seconds. Pemberton didn't ask questions. He simply said, "I'll make some calls," and hung up. Then came Dr. Susan Whelan, Chief Medical Officer, who owed Hargrove a favor from 5 years ago when he'd covered a malpractice incident she'd rather the state board never see. Then Patricia Torres in HR, who'd been receiving consulting payments under the table for 3 years for helping Hargrove navigate his divorce with minimal scrutiny. The calls were calm. The voice on the other end of Hargrove's mouth sounded almost reasonable. "We have a compliance problem with one of the newer nurses. Possible scope violations. I'd hate for this to become a legal issue, but we need to act quickly. Documentation, interviews, immediate separation. Standard protocol." Standard protocol. Those two words made everything sound inevitable, like the laws of physics rather than the decisions of a man cornered and terrified. By 14:30 hours, the second wave began. Hargrove's assistant placed calls to every reference listed on Natalie's temporary agency paperwork. He had a script, carefully worded, legally armored, devastating in its specificity. "We're conducting a routine credentialing review and wanted to verify her performance history. Did you notice any tendency to work outside her scope? Any concerns about her clinical judgment? Any issues with her reliability?" 3 references said they barely remembered her. 1 said she was fine. But Hargrove only needed one person to hesitate, to say something vague like, well, she was very independent in her thinking, which the script twisted into independent meaning reckless, thinking meaning beyond her training. The fabrications didn't need to be obvious. They just needed to create a paper trail that looked credible enough to justify what was already decided. At 1,500 hours, an external investigator named Mitchell arrived at Sacred Heart with a leather folder and the bearing of a man who'd been promised $15,000 for a 3-hour investigation. He was competent at his job. Mitchell had conducted 47 of these investigations. He knew how to walk into a hospital, interview 3 carefully selected staff members who'd been primed by email to discuss Natalie's aggressive assumption of responsibility, and produce a report that made recklessness look like evidence. The pericardiocentesis, the procedure that had saved a Marine general's life, became unauthorized needle decompression performed without attending physician authorization. The medical terminology was there. The facts were there. The interpretation was a weapon. By 16:45 hours, the paperwork was complete. A 4-page investigation summary with the official hospital seal, citing scope violations, insubordination during crisis situations, and failure to follow chain of command protocols. Everything in the report was technically true. Everything in the report was also a lie. Natalie had saved a man's life. The report made it sound like she'd committed an act of violence. At 1,700 hours exactly, 2 security guards appeared at the nurse's station where Natalie was finishing her charting. She didn't look up from the keyboard. She knew. The guards were tall men with that particular combination of politeness and immovability that only comes from years of removing people from buildings. "Miss Hayes," the one on the left said, and the words fell into the ER like stones into still water. "You need to come with us." She saved the document. Deleted nothing. Left her password exactly as it was. When you've been trained to disappear, you learn to leave no traces that suggest you're trying to hide. You just go. The walk through the ER felt like moving through amber. She was aware of eyes not meeting hers. She was aware of mouths making small O shapes and then closing. She was aware of Dr. Hargrove standing near the medication dispensary, arms crossed, watching with the expression of a man who'd just watched his trap spring shut. He smiled. His teeth showed first. Then the rest of his face caught up, but the smile never reached his eyes. It was the smile of someone who'd eliminated a threat and was already calculating the next move. The HR office on the 3rd floor smelled like carpet cleaner and the particular staleness of institutional waiting rooms. Patricia Torres sat behind a desk with a manila folder positioned exactly in the center like a place setting at a formal dinner. "Natalie, I'm going to need your badge," she said, and Natalie slid it across the desk. Torres picked it up with 2 fingers, walked to a small device that looked like it belonged in a library, and inserted the badge. There was a sound, a magnetic swipe that made a soft mechanical hiss, like the last breath leaving a body. "Your employment with Sacred Heart ends effective immediately," Torres said. The words sounded rehearsed. Probably they were. "You'll receive 2 weeks severance due to the suddenness of the termination. There's a box for your personal belongings." She pointed to a cardboard box on the floor beside the desk. "Security will escort you to your locker." The locker was in the break room, the same break room where Hargrove had thrown down that $20 bill 7 days ago like he was feeding animals in a zoo. Her locker contained a spare pair of scrubs, a water bottle with the Sacred Heart logo fading on the side, and at the bottom, the only thing that mattered, the pair of combat boots she'd carried through Ramadi. Cracked leather. Sand still embedded in the treads. A small section of the left heel worn smooth where shrapnel had grazed it during the siege at the Al-Anbar Province Field Hospital in July 2011. Those boots had stood on concrete floors for 16 hours while mortars fell outside. Those boots had been filled with blood that wasn't hers. Those boots had been ordered into a Pentagon office where 3 senators had decided that the operation they represented never happened, that the woman who wore them should stop existing, that speaking about what occurred in that field hospital would violate national security and endanger operatives still in theater. She'd kept the boots. It was the only rebellion she'd allowed herself, keeping one physical object that proved the life she'd lived was real, that Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes had existed somewhere outside the erasure. The Pentagon had taken her service record. They'd taken her official identity. They'd taken her name off every deployment document. But they couldn't take the boots. Boots weren't classified information. She put them in the box. The security guard, a young man who wouldn't meet her eyes, escorted her through the ER one more time. Past the nurse's station. Past the patients in the waiting room. Past the whiteboard where her name had been erased from the shift schedule sometime in the last hour. The smell of antiseptic was still there. The ventilators still wheezed their mechanical rhythm. The monitors still beat their electronic pulse. But Natalie Hayes wasn't part of it anymore. Officially, she had never been. The parking lot was beginning to empty as the day shift left and the evening crew arrived. She sat in her car for 7 minutes, she would remember the exact time later, 1,747 hours, and then drove to the VA hospital across town. The one where she'd been seen in 3 separate emergency rooms over the past 6 years, always using her civilian name, always presenting as just another patient. Never as the woman who'd performed emergency surgery in a dust storm. Never as the woman whose hands had held together people who would have died in civilian hospitals. The waiting room at the VA was familiar. Blue plastic chairs bolted to the floor. A television showing news with the sound off. The smell of industrial floor wax and someone's cologne that was trying too hard to cover up the smell of unwashed clothing that came from surviving the streets. She took a number from the automated dispenser and sat down. An army ranger with a prosthetic left leg sat 3 chairs over, his face a map of the roads he'd walked that his body couldn't anymore. A Marine with burn scars that made his face look like melted wax sat near the window, staring at something none of the living could see. An Air Force PJ in a faded PT uniform sat across from her with the 1,000-yard stare that came from having flown missions she wasn't supposed to think about. She'd treated men like these in the field. She'd held their hands while tourniquets bit into their limbs. She'd dug shrapnel out of places shrapnel shouldn't go. She'd told them they were going to be okay in a voice that made them believe it even when she wasn't sure it was true. Now she was sitting in a waiting room with a cardboard box containing combat boots, waiting to see a doctor about anxiety medication, and none of these men recognized her because recognition was impossible. She was invisible. A nurse called her name, her civilian name, the one on the paperwork she'd filled out, and Natalie stood up with the box in her hands. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like insects trapped behind plastic. Someone coughed. Someone else's prosthetic leg made a sound like metal on linoleum as he shifted in his chair. The weight of invisibility pressed down on her chest with a force she almost hadn't felt in 7 years. She'd been trained to disappear. The Pentagon had made sure of that. But she'd never been trained for what it felt like when the invisibility was total. When there was no mission behind it. When she was just erased. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 17 miles away, the Marine general had regained consciousness in the ICU with no memory of the procedure that saved his life, only a single image burned into his mind, a pair of hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this in a sandstorm under mortar fire. A pair of hands that belonged to someone he'd served with. Someone he'd thought died in Ramadi. Someone named Reaper. And the calls were about to begin. The Marine general's eyes opened at 0800 the next morning. Sharp. Clear. The kind of consciousness that comes from someone trained to wake ready for combat. He moved his hand to his chest, felt the bandage, and his jaw tightened. A nurse appeared at his bedside within seconds. He'd been monitoring for exactly this moment. "Who saved my life?" Not a question. A demand. An order issued from someone accustomed to obedience. The nurse hesitated, glanced at the chart. "I'll get the administrator, sir." But the general was already reaching for his phone, his security detail already moving. Somewhere in the hospital's personnel records, someone had entered a name. Somewhere in the machinery of bureaucracy, there was a paper trail. He was going to find it. By 0847, his daughter walked through the door in marine dress blues, Captain Sarah Whitmore, and her presence changed the air in the room like a pressure system shifting. She kissed her father's forehead and he said 2 words, "Reaper." Her expression didn't flicker. "The one from Ramadi." The general nodded. Captain Whitmore turned to the attending physician and stated it as fact, not question. "That woman is a senior chief petty officer." Not was. Is. The present tense of someone who understands rank structure and what it means. The attending blinked. Started to say something about nursing credentials. Captain Whitmore held up one hand. "Call the administrator. Now." The hospital administrator, Mrs. Joyce Chen, arrived at the general's suite within 12 minutes, and the general's security clearance did something to the locks and passwords that had protected Natalie's file for 7 years. Mrs. Chen's hands trembled as she opened the classified folder, trembled the way hands shake when they're holding something that changes the weight of the world. 3 tours. Fallujah, 2004. Ramadi, 2005 to 2006. Helmand Province, 2007. Field surgeries performed in conditions no civilian hospital could simulate. 19 lives saved in a bunker that took incoming mortar fire. 32 combat medical interventions. Commendations that made her qualifications at Sacred Heart look like a high school CPR card. Mrs. Chen read aloud in a voice that got smaller with every sentence. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Marie Hayes. Medical Operations Chief, Naval Special Warfare Command. The room didn't just go quiet. The room held its breath. The Navy SEAL team leader arrived at 1015. Commander Michael Graves, callsign Gator, walked into the hospital conference room with the kind of presence that made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer by comparison. He didn't shake hands. He stood at the head of the table and looked directly at Dr. Hargrove, who'd been summoned believing this was routine, and Graves' voice came out like a transmission from a tank turret, low and precise. Senior Chief Hayes holds the Navy Cross. Pause. Breath. 2 silver stars. Another pause, letting the weight settle. And a purple heart. The silence stretched long enough to hear a pen drop on linoleum. Hargrove's face drained of color like someone had pulled a drain plug. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again with no sound coming out. The FBI agent walked in 17 minutes later with 2 other agents and a folder thick as a dictionary. His name was David Mercer, federal investigator, and his voice carried the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been following paper trails through hospitals before Hargrove ever showed up at Sacred Heart. "We've been investigating medical fraud at this facility for 14 months, Mercer said, and he laid out the timeline like dominoes. Med Supply Corp kickback scheme. Inflated invoices. Phantom equipment orders. Hargrove's bank account receiving deposits totaling $340,000. The falsified personnel complaints about Natalie generated in less than 3 hours and timed to coincide exactly with her saving the Marine General's life. And we have him on tape." Mercer produced a recording device, and Hargrove's own voice played back in the conference room, him calling board members, fabricating details, saying the words federal witness and needs to disappear. It wasn't a request. It was evidence. Security escorted Dr. Hargrove out at 13:47, and they walked him straight through the ER at shift change. The cafeteria was full. 40 staff members eating lunch, and Hargrove's face turned the color of dried blood as they moved him through the center of the room in handcuffs. His polo shirt had sweat stains spreading down the ribs. His eyes wouldn't focus. Someone dropped a fork. The sound echoed across the tile floor like a gunshot in a tomb. He didn't lift his head. Didn't meet anyone's gaze. The scrub tech who'd recognized Natalie's hands watched him pass and made a small gesture, a shake of the head, the kind of movement that said everything about hierarchy and who actually held power in that room. By afternoon, the state medical board had suspended his license pending investigation. By 6 weeks, it was revoked permanently. Natalie heard through a coworker that he'd taken a job at a strip mall near the airport, sitting at a folding table between a tax preparation service and a vape shop, selling supplemental insurance to anyone who made eye contact. His polo shirt had coffee stains. His hair needed cutting. He didn't smile anymore. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. The moment everything changed came at 1900 when a Marine captain in dress blue showed up at Natalie's apartment door. Captain Sarah Whitmore. No uniform insignia was needed, she moved like someone accustomed to command, and when she spoke, the words came out with the precision of someone delivering orders. "My father wants to thank you in person, Senior Chief. And the hospital board wants to offer you a position. Director of Emergency Medical Services." She paused. "Let that settle. If you want it." Natalie stood in her doorway in civilian clothes, holding the anxiety medication prescription she'd never filled, the one that said her trauma was supposed to be treated with pills instead of purpose. For the first time in 7 years, someone called her by her rank. Not nurse. Not sweetheart. Senior Chief. The 2 words hit her like a defibrillator shock to the chest, pain that meant she was still alive. 2 weeks later, Natalie stood in the Sacred Heart Hospital auditorium in Navy service uniform, dress blues darker than the night sky outside, ribbons across her chest telling stories she wasn't authorized to speak aloud. The Marine General, recovered fully, moved to the podium. His hand reached out and pinned new credentials to her uniform, the Director of Emergency Medical Services, Sacred Heart Hospital, and the gesture carried the weight of formal recognition, of honor being returned after 7 years of erasure. Behind her, mounted in a shadow box with museum lighting, sat her worn combat boots from Ramadi. Sand still embedded in the laces. Salt stains from desert sweat dried into the leather. A brass plaque read, "Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, USN, Sacred Heart's most decorated employee." The ER staff who'd watched her get humiliated stood applauding. The scrub tech who recognized her 3-stitch technique saluted, not casual, full military salute, fist across chest, eyes forward. Dr. Morrison, the attending who froze during the cardiac crisis, shook her hand and asked if she'd teach a course on emergency procedures. "Monday nights," he said, hope in his voice. She smiled, the first real smile anyone at Sacred Heart had seen on her face, and said yes. That evening, she returned to the VA hospital waiting room. Not as a patient. Not to fill prescriptions or seek treatment for the ghosts that lived in her chest. She posted flyers announcing free emergency medical training for veterans seeking healthcare careers. The Army Ranger with the prosthetic leg from her first night, the one she'd sat beside in silence, approached her and asked if she was hiring. "Show up Monday in clean scrubs and we'll talk," she said. His eyes got wet. He nodded and walked away without another word, already believing in something again. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you made it this far, you already know the truth. The quiet ones are always the most dangerous. The ones who've seen the worst are the ones who give the most. Subscribe to see more stories about the hidden heroes walking among us. Like if you would have done the same thing in her position. And comment, what would you do if the Pentagon called your workplace? What would change if everyone knew who you really were?